بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا وارفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. اللهم ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. اللهم فك الكرب عن إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم فك الكرب عن إخواننا في غزة وفي فلسطين وفي لبنان وفي السودان وفي كل مكان أنت أعلم بهم منا. اللهم ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. وصل اللهم وسلم وبارك وأنعم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Ameen. So inshallah we'll get started. Just before we start, Ustad Munzir was supposed to be here with us, but he extends his apologies. He's not able to make it today. He had an emergency that came up. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for him and his family and to bless him with goodness in this life and the hereafter. We'll still be talking about the same topic, inshallah. If he was here, we would have had two perspectives. Alhamdulillah, inshallah, we'll share what we have and we'll continue with the rest of the night. And inshallah, before we start, we have some announcements that Brother Adam is going to share with us.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Like we always do, just a few reminders, which is, if you're going to have any conversations, please keep it outside of the main musalla. And like always, we have refreshments on both sides. Inshallah, tonight, the topic is going to be prophetic guidance and dealing with sadness and grief. And just a few reminders of the programs we have going on here at ICPC. Tomorrow night, actually, we have Faith Foundations, a guide for new Muslims, and that will be at 6 p.m., inshallah, here at ICPC. It's going to be an Ask Me Anything, and it's for new Muslims. So if you know any new Muslims recently converted or have been converted, this is a great resource. I highly recommend you suggest that they attend. Additionally, not here at ICPC Clifton, but in Patterson, they just started the Quran classes for adults, and that's every Saturday from 6 to 7:30. They have two versions, Nuraniya for beginners and Tajweed for intermediate students. Additionally, something actually fun for the brothers, bit of physical activity. They have a jiu-jitsu program starting at ICPC. It just started. It is $60 a month, and you get, I believe, four classes a month. Registration is online, so if you check out the ICPC email list or the WhatsApp group, you can definitely sign up. And it's for intermediates all the way to advanced, so if you have some experience in jiu-jitsu, you can definitely join, or if not, you don't have to have any. Further, they have a sisters cooking session at ICPC coming up on Tuesdays at ICPC Patterson, so that's something for the sisters. And another thing for our converts in the community is a new Muslims monthly meetup. It's going to be this Sunday, inshallah, the 17th. 2 p.m. at Prince Takari in Hackensack. So again, if you know any converts that have any questions, this is a great way to support them. Let them know about these initiatives, inshallah. And with that, I pass it off to our brother and get started. Actually, I'm sorry. One more thing. If you have any questions, please add them to the Slido. You can always raise your hand for questions. Try and keep them relevant. If we run out of relevant questions, then we will then go to the highest voted non-relevant questions, inshallah.
So I didn't want to share too much information without permission, but since Sidi Munzir, he gave me permission to speak about it. His family is expecting. Inshallah, they're expecting a baby. So that's the emergency that he had to go for. So inshallah, he asks you all to keep him and his family in your dua, that everything inshallah goes well. And hopefully we'll get some good news soon, inshallah. As many of you have seen, the topic today was regarding prophetic guidance on sadness and grief. And the topic really came to mind just a few weeks ago. I was here with Sheikh Osama, and I remember someone had asked the question on the Slido that how can they deal with day-to-day living when they wake up with so much sadness, when they see what's going on in Gaza and around the world in general. How can they get themselves to act? And it's a topic that we really don't speak about a lot, although it's such an important emotion and state that we all go through, right? Every single one of us, I think, can say that they've experienced moments of sadness and grief. Unless you've been immensely blessed in this life, or you've never seen a day of sadness, or maybe you don't process emotions in a certain way. I think every single one of us have gone through those moments. So it's a completely normal thing to go through. And it's not something that distinguishes between someone who's brown or someone who's white or someone who's even Muslim or non-Muslim. This is an emotion, a state that everyone experiences, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. Sadness is something that is a human phenomenon. Everyone's going to experience it. And collectively, as an ummah, we're all going through it. For the last year, many of us have been feeling this sadness and this grief over what's going on to the ummah collectively. And then we also have our own moments of sadness and grief that we have in our own lives, right? With everything that's happening in Gaza, Palestine, Lebanon, all these other places, it doesn't mean that our lives come to a stop. Our lives also have these moments of sadness and loss. So this emotion specifically, I think we can all agree and say that it can be very suffocating. It can be very crushing, right? It can be very debilitating, the emotion of grief. And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions this to us in a hadith, where he says, "Man nafasa an Muslimin karbatan min kurab ad-dunya, nafasa Allahu anhu kurbatan min kurab al-akhirah." The Prophet ﷺ, he says, whoever relieves a believer, when we translate this, we say, whoever relieves a believer from a difficulty in this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves him from a difficulty in the hereafter. Nafasa comes from tanfis, and that comes from the word nafas. What does nafas mean? Is your breath, is your breathing. So when you tunafis wahid, you're basically, it's like they have a noose around their neck, and you're just opening it up and giving them some relief, which means that difficulties, hardships in this life, they have that effect, that suffocating effect, that you can't breathe, you can't get out of it. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he teaches us a dua, where he seeks refuge from huzn or hazn, sadness and grief. Everyone has heard that dua where the Prophet says, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from ham, from distress, from worry, and hazan, and from sadness. Wa min al-ajzi wal-kasal. And I seek refuge in you from incapacity and from laziness. Wa min al-jub wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bukhl. And I seek refuge in you from cowardice and miserliness, being cheap. وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ غَلَبَةِ الدَّيْنِ وَقَهْرِ الرِّجَالِ. And I seek refuge in you from overwhelming debt and the overpowering of men. So this is something that the Prophet ﷺ, he sought refuge in, and he taught us to seek refuge in. So it's not something that's sought, it's not something that we feel comfortable in, it's not something that we would want, we want in our lives. But at the same time, it is part of the experience of being a human being. So, like we mentioned, it's something that everyone experiences. And also, although we're not liable for the emotions that we have, we are liable on how we react to those emotions. So someone may say, okay, I don't need guidance on this issue, but we do need guidance. Why? Because how do we respond when we go through moments of sadness and grief? Right? Because there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُعَذِّبْ بِدُمُوعِ الْعَيْنِ وَبِحُزْنِ الْقَلْبِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't punish you for the tears that you shed and the sadness or the grief that's in your heart. وَلَكِنْ يُعَذِّبْ بِهَذَا وَأَشَارَ إِلَى لِسَانِهِ. He says, but He punishes you for this. And then He pointed at His tongue. أَوْ يَرْحَمْ. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mercy. So it's not the emotion that you're necessarily in charge of or you're held to account for. But how is it that you respond? Like, how is it that you respond when you have that emotion? Are you expressing that emotion in the wrong way? Or are you showing displeasure in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So that's number two, because we are liable on how we react to it, so we need to know how to respond and how to deal with it. And number three is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, there's this beautiful statement that one of the scholars, he says, and I'll read it for you here, he says, لم يأتي الحزن في القرآن إلا منهيا عنه أو منفيا. That huzn, sadness, is never mentioned in the Quran, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids you from it, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negates it, And he says that فَالْمَنْهِيُ عَنْهُ كَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنْ عَلَيْهِمْ وَقَوْلُهُ لَا تَحْزَنْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَنَا. That every time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions sadness, where He's forbidding you from it, He said, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. Don't be powerless, don't be sad. وَلَا تَحْزَنْ عَلَيْهِمْ. Don't be sad over them, don't grieve over them, over the disbelievers when they disbelieve and they don't follow the guidance. And then he quotes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quotes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he was with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He says, لا تحزن إن الله معنا. Don't be sad, Allah is with us. And then he subhanahu wa ta'ala also negates it. He says, وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. That the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they have no fear and they have no sadness in the hereafter. Right? So here we see in the Quran that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about sadness, it's something that's negated. It's either forbidden or it's negated. So now, how do we interact with this specific emotion or the state that we all go through? You know, one of the questions I guess I wanted to ask everyone is, can believers be sad or can they grieve? Can a true believer, someone who's a true believer, can they be sad or can they grieve? Who says they can? They can? They can? Who says they can? Does anyone have any proof that a believer can? Yes. Yeah, so the believer, to say can the believer grieve or can they get sad, is like saying, can the believer get sick? It's something human. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inculcated within us. And we see in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the believers when they enter paradise, He says that they make a dua. They say, Alhamdulillah alladhi adhaba anna al-hazan. What do they say? They say, oh, Alhamdulillah, thanks be to Allah, gratitude be to Allah, the one who's removed hazan from us, from sadness from us. Meaning what? In the life of this world, they experience sadness. They must have experienced it for them to be grateful to come to a place where they no longer have it anymore. So of course a believer can get sad. And we see in multiple stories, not only of the Prophet ﷺ, but within the Quran we see that the prophets did get sad. When you look at the story of Ayyub alayhi salam, he loses his entire family in one shot. He loses all of his wealth. He loses his health. Everything within him in the blink of an eye. And then he makes a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rabbi inni massani ad-durru wa anta arhamur rahimin. Oh Allah, oh my Lord, I've been afflicted with harm. Wa anta arhamur rahimin. You're the most merciful. You see the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and Yaqub alayhi salam, filled grief. And we'll touch on that. Yaqub alayhi salam, his grief reaches such a point that it physically affects him. He loses his eyesight. And then of course we have in the life of the Prophet ﷺ so many moments of grief. Right? From the moment the Prophet ﷺ was born, you can say it's a moment of sadness because he's born and he doesn't have a father. And then at age 6 he loses his mother. And then a few years later he loses his grandfather. And so he loses everyone that's beloved to him. And then in his own life, he buries every one of his children except for one. So you see that this is like a reoccurring theme in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So how did he deal with it? You know, when it comes to the Battle of Uhud even, the Prophet ﷺ loses his beloved uncle, Hamza. And you can tell when you read the seerah, anyone who reads the seerah can see that the Prophet ﷺ, although of course he accepts that loss, he never really fully heals from that pain of losing Hamza radiallahu anhu. Because years later, the man who killed Hamza radiallahu anhu becomes Muslim, Wahshi becomes Muslim. And when he comes to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells him that he doesn't want to see him. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ is being harsh with him? No. Because the Prophet ﷺ still can't get over the grief of losing his uncle, so he doesn't want to be unjust to Wahshi. That if Wahshi comes in front of him, he doesn't want to mistreat him because of maybe that sadness that he's still feeling. And the biggest example of the sadness that the Prophet ﷺ experienced is what? Is a whole year in his life. Right? When you read the seerah, you see that the Prophet ﷺ, there's a whole section in every seerah book called the Amul Huzn, the year of sadness. You know, the year of sadness was the 10th year after the Prophet ﷺ became a prophet, the 10th year. And what happens is the Muslims are kind of like at a standstill. They're not really increasing in number. It's kind of staying stagnant. The number is staying the same. There's not really much progress going on. Quraysh is increasing its persecution of the Muslims. They're increasing their torture, their repression. They kill Sumayya radiallahu anha. They kill Ammar radiallahu anhu. They torture Bilal radiallahu anhu. They torture Khabbab. The Prophet is seeing all of this. And then on top of that, you have a group of the believers who leave to Abyssinia. So the numbers are even less now in Mecca. They have to migrate because they have to run for their deen, that there has to be another safe haven for them. So they leave. And in the midst of all of this, the Prophet ﷺ loses Khadija radiallahu anha, his backbone, right? The person that he relied on. You know, there's a statement from the Prophet ﷺ that I never experienced the harm from Quraysh. I never felt that harm until I lost Khadija radiallahu anha. So for 10 years, he didn't feel it. Why? Because he would come home and his wife would be there. Khadija radiallahu anha would be there. She'd be supporting him. She'd be reinvigorating him, recalibrating him, and he'd feel ease. And then within a month's time, he loses his uncle Abu Talib. You know, Abu Talib was his public protection. His uncle, the one who raised him, and his public protection. He comes to the deathbed of Abu Talib, and they don't even allow him by the head of Abu Talib. They keep him away. And then he goes by the feet of Abu Talib and he pleads to him that, Ya Am, please accept Islam. Just say that word, kalimatan uhajju laka inda Allahi biha. That just say that one word, just say the kalima, just say ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah, so I can make a case for you in front of Allah. And he doesn't accept. And then he vows that he's going to seek forgiveness for him. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him that he's not allowed to seek forgiveness for him because he died on kufr. So can you just imagine the level of grief and sadness the Prophet ﷺ is going through in this moment? All of those things that we just mentioned, and it's just building up. So he loses his personal relief at home, and then he loses his public security. He has no one to protect him. And then Abu Lahab comes and he says, I'll protect you. But then he pulls back on that as well because Quraysh starts to pressure him, and so he has no one. And then in the midst of all of this, the Prophet ﷺ, he leaves Mecca. He doesn't give up. You know, this just shows you, and this is like the first stop we can take on prophetic guidance when it comes to sadness and grief. Can you imagine just losing your companions during that year, and then losing your beloved wife, losing your uncle, having no support, and then still having the strength to continue? Like many of us would have probably given up, been like, how can I continue after this? But this is the prophetic guidance that despite the sadness that you have, the grief that you have, it doesn't stop. You should never let the sadness and grief debilitate you or you become incapacitated. Because as soon as you become, you start saying that there's no hope, I'm hopeless, you lose purpose. When you lose purpose, you lose your life. You squander the opportunities that Allah has given you. So the Prophet ﷺ, he carries on. He doesn't stop. He doesn't say that that's it. I've lost everything. Like, is there anything more that I can lose? Think about it. There's nothing left. There's nothing left from Mecca. So he leaves Mecca and he goes to Ta'if. Ta'if is not this city that's like friends with Mecca. Ta'if is the rival city of the Meccans. They're like rivals. They're enemies. So he's leaving now his city. He's going to a rival territory. He knows that if he comes back and they see him, they will probably kill him. And he goes to the leaders of Ta'if and he asks them for help. And he asks them to come and assist his da'wah, to assist Islam and accept Islam. What do? They pelt him out of Ta'if. The slaves of Ta'if and the children of Ta'if, they pelt him out with stones. And this is like, if there was a breaking point, this would be a breaking point, right? Like, think about everything that's built up until this point. This would be a breaking point. And that's when you have that beautiful dua that the Prophet ﷺ made, dua al-mustada'afin, where the Prophet says, Allahumma inni ashku ilayka du'afa quwwati. Oh Allah, I complain to you of my weakness, wa qillata hilati, and my lack of means, wa hawani ala nas, and my insignificance in front of people. Anta ya arhamar rahimin, O the most merciful of the mercifuls. Anta rabbul mustad'afin, you are the Lord of those who are weak. Wa anta rabbi, and you are my Lord. And then he says, إِلَى مَنْ تَكِلُنِي? Who will you leave me to, O Allah? إِلَى بَعِيدٍ يَتَجَهَّمُنِي? Are you going to leave me to someone who's far from me, who's going to frown at me, scowl me, leave me, abandon me? أو إلى عدو ملكته أمري? Or are you going to give my affair over to an enemy? Are you going to give power of an enemy over me? And then he says something very beautiful. He says, إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ غَضَبُكَ عَلَيَّ فَلَا أُبَالِي. He says that if you're not angry with me, all of this is okay, Ya Allah. Everything that's happened up to this point, this year of sadness, this casting me out of Ta'if, all of this is okay as long as you're not angry with me. As long as you're not angry with me. That I'm willing to put up with all of this. So in his grief, in his sadness, he pours out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the second point of reflection that we should be having, is that whenever we have these moments of sadness and grief, we pour out to Allah. You know, I had a patient one time who he was going through depression. He was saying to me, he said a beautiful statement. I'll never forget it. Tears are a language only God understands. You know, people can be as compassionate as possible, you know, as they can be. You know, you have difficulties, you go to your friend, you go to your mother, you go to anyone. They'll show you compassion. They'll show you empathy, sympathy. But at the end of the day, the only one who will truly understand the pain that you're going through and the difficulty that you're going through and the grief that you're going through is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, like, pouring your heart out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam does after Ta'if. And then after that, you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them like these glimpses of relief. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he accepts Islam. Jubair bin Mut'im, who was a nobleman of Mecca, he tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, come back to Mecca, I will offer you protection. You are under my protection. We also know that there's a group of jinn. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about in Surah Al-Jinn. They accept Islam. These entities that the Prophet ﷺ cannot see. So like it's not full relief, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him moments of relief, small victories. That Abbas accepts Islam. Jubair bin Mut'im is now going to protect you. The jinn have accepted Islam. So when this tells us what? That when you go through difficulty, you just need to keep going. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give you those small things, those small bursts of relief that are going to keep you going. When you read the verse, إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, with difficulty is ease. Right? The scholars, they say it's not like after difficulty comes ease. It's with the difficulty itself, مَعَهُ الْيُسْرِ. The ease comes with the difficulty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you, He propels you. As long as you're moving forward, as long as you're doing what you need to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to push you forward. And then all of that culminates into what? The Isra and the Mi'raj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That all that year of sadness, of grief, of loss, of betrayal, and then all that culminates in this spiritual journey, upliftment, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and shows him things that nothing in this world could have ever given him. Like, think about all this time the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is speaking about Jannah, he's speaking about Jahannam, he's speaking about angels, he's speaking about the prophets, and now he sees them and he speaks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly on this night. It just reinvigorates him, and it gives him the spiritual strength to be certain that everything that I'm preaching, everything that I'm calling to is true. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him this, and on top of that, the biggest gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him at that moment is what? Patience. On Isra al-Mi'raj, the biggest takeaway. The prayer, salah. After all of that, the biggest gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to the Prophet ﷺ is salah. That this is your connection, this is how you connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That after all this difficulty, this is the gift, to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 5 times a day. And that's a gift to not just the Prophet ﷺ, it's a gift to you and I. Every one of us is getting that gift. It's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took the Prophet ﷺ to the 7 heavens to give him this specific commandment and this specific gift to us. And then what happens after that year? the Prophet comes back, he starts working, he continues. And right after that, like a year later, the Medinans come, people from Medina come, they accept Islam. And then just 2 years later after that, the Prophet ﷺ goes to Medina. He goes to Medina, and the Muslims have a platform now. They have a state, they have a city that's completely theirs. So the relief came. That after all of that difficulty and that hardship, a relief came. So there's so much to unpack and so much to learn from this. But one of the biggest takeaways is that when we're struck with grief as a ummah, you have to understand that there's things that are happening in the background. That you have a pixel and the picture is in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're just looking at the pixel. You know, if you have an ant, if the ant is walking on like a piece of carpet, like a beautiful carpet, like this carpet, or like a tapestry, can the ant ever appreciate the beauty of that tapestry? Who's kind of enjoying that? Who's appreciating that? The one who made the tapestry, he's looking at it from far and he's seeing all the beautiful colors and he's seeing all the beautiful patterns, but the little ant that's walking on it doesn't see that. So whenever we see these moments of griefs in their personal life or collectively as an ummah, you have to understand that, or we all have to understand, that this is just part of the picture, that we don't see the whole picture. If you went back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and you saw these things unfolding in the Prophet ﷺ's life, like the lowest point of his life, would you have imagined that just in 10 years, the Prophet ﷺ would have been, or just in 13 years, he would be coming back to Mecca with an army of 10,000? All of the Arab tribes have joined him, and they're coming back victorious into Mecca? Could you have even imagined that 13 years before? You couldn't have. So this tells us that even in moments of grief and sadness and difficulty, that there's always something happening in the background. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing things. That's why Yusuf alayhi salam, you know, when you read the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, from the second page, the third page, the treachery starts. His brothers are treacherous to him. They throw him into a well. He gets sold into slavery. Then he gets accused of the most heinous crime. Like you can get I guess accused of a crime, but he gets accused of the worst crime. And then he goes into jail. He stays there for anywhere from 3 to 9 years. Bid'a sinin is anywhere from 3 to 9 years. He's in prison for a crime he doesn't commit. And then he finally comes out, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings it all back around 360. He brings his family back to him, brings his brothers back to him, brings his dream into fruition. And then what does he say? He says, Inna Rabbi latifun lima yasha. My Lord is subtle. Latif. He's subtle. He's gentle in the things he does. Whatever he wishes, whatever he wants to do, he's gentle in that. He's subtle in that. You could have never imagined this story to play out the way it does. And that's the story of the Prophet ﷺ and all of the prophets. And this is the story of the Ummah. You know, there's so many things that happen in the background that you're completely unaware of. You know, even before, when the Muslims lost Al-Quds, you know, just before Salah ad-Din took Quds back, before Hittin, before the Battle of Hittin happened, right before they went back to take Quds, he was ready to go into a treaty with the Crusaders. But the way that things played out so fast, he was able to take advantage of the situation and take the Quds back. So whenever you see any sadness, whether it's on a personal level in your life, in the grief that you may be going through, or collectively as a ummah, know that there's always a way out. There's always things that are happening in the background. The main thing that you always you want to take away is that continue to be functional. Don't let grief make you incapacitated and not work towards anything. Because every prophet we see, despite the difficulties that they went through, they always worked. Even when you see Yaqub alayhi salam, he had so much grief, right? He lost his eyesight, he loses his son, Yusuf, and then he loses Binyamin, and his other son stays back because he doesn't want to face him. So he has 3 sons who are completely, like, he has no idea what's going on with them. And then he says to his sons, يَا بَنِيَّ اذْهَبُوا فَتَحَسَّسُوا عَنْ يُوسُفَ وَأَخِيهِ وَلَا تَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رُوحِ اللَّهِ. He says, go back. He tells his sons, my sons, go and go look for Yusuf. Yusuf has been gone for over 10 years. He says, go look for Yusuf and his brother, and don't despair of Allah's mercy. So continue to be functional. Don't let it make you unfunctional. Also, never lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And never despair and think that there's no hope. Because where does desperation come from? Desperation comes from when you think that there's no other way out. When you don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's easy to believe there's no other way out. When you look at the material means and you see everything is just not adding up, it's easy for you to say there's no way out. But when you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you believe that there's something else going on in the background, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all powerful over all things, anything is possible. So never losing that hope, never having that despair, continuing to be functional, continuing to be connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And realizing that it's all a test. You know, your life, from the moment you wake up every morning, it's a test. To the moment you go to sleep, every second you're being tested. So when you put that into perspective, these moments of sadness and grief that you go through, they make sense. You can make sense of them. That there's a greater purpose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching me at all times. How am I going to respond to this? And there's a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ also regarding this, that allows us to put grief into perspective. Where he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ما يصيب المسلم من نصب ولا وصب ولا هم ولا حزن ولا أذى ولا غم حتى الشوكة يشاكها إلا كفر الله به خطاياه. The Prophet says that no Muslim is afflicted, and listen to this, no Muslim is afflicted by nasab, by fatigue, or disease, or worry, or sadness, or harm, or distress. These are like emotions, these are states that you feel. No Muslim is afflicted by these. Even a thorn that pricks his finger, إِلَّا كَفَّرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَطَايَاهُ, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this as means to purify him from his sins. So those moments of sadness that you go through, those moments of grief, as long as you're not voicing them in a way that is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're removing sin from you. They're elevating your status in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's so many points that I wanted to mention, but that those are some of the points that we can reflect on. And the last thing is always be positive and look at the stories of the prophets. Draw inspiration from their stories and see how did they respond. And you'll see that their lives were lives that were filled with sadness and filled with grief, but that never stopped them. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us with steadfastness and to allow us to maneuver through sadness and through grief, and to allow us to constantly take inspiration from the lives of the prophets, from the Quran, in navigating that space. It's a very difficult space. Anyone who experiences deep grief really can sympathize and empathize with that. That just as we mentioned, it can almost be handicapped. You can feel handicapped. You can feel like you don't want to do anything. But inshallah, with some of these things that we mentioned today, some of the reflections that we had, we'll be able to kind of navigate the space a little bit more. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His assistance.
Inshallah, we have a few questions in the Slido, but actually we're going to change it up a little bit this time. And before we get to the Slido, I want to see if there's anybody in the crowd that has a direct question related to what we just spoke about. Okay, straight to the Slido. Inshallah, the question goes, if Allah is the only one who can understand our tears, then is it worth it to talk to people about your sadness? I sometimes regret telling others about my worries.
So this is not professional advice. Of course, there's certain levels of sadness and grief and depression that requires you to seek aid. So the things that we mention are not things we mentioned today. Doesn't mean that a person cannot go through like even deeper moments of sadness or grief that might not require them to see someone or to seek professional help. I think that's very important. Sometimes you have to see a therapist, you have to see a counselor, you have to speak to the imam, someone who can give you a little bit more guidance. Maybe you're coming from a point where you're not seeing things clearly. And that happens a lot. When emotions come into the equation, you don't see things clearly. It just takes someone who means well, like a well-wisher, to tell you or to highlight certain things for you to see that thing in the correct light. So I wouldn't say that it's not worth it to speak to someone, because if someone, this someone that you're speaking to wishes well for you, is someone who wants good for you, is more knowledgeable than you, maybe even more religious than you, then they might not harm to speak to that person because they may give you words of comfort that you may not know. Sometimes look at the story of the Prophet ﷺ's passing. When he ﷺ passed away, Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu was like in an emotional state where he came to the masjid and he said that if anyone says the Prophet is dead, then I'm going to kill him. So you can see, like, Umar being the person he is, radiallahu anhu, one of the greatest companions, he was overtaken by these emotions that he could not process them. And all it took was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to get up and say that whoever used to worship Muhammad, then know that Muhammad has passed away. And whoever used to worship Allah, know that Allah is all living and He never dies. And then he recited the verse. And Umar radiallahu anhu says, when he recited the verse of the Prophet ﷺ being a man, it's as if I heard the verse for the first time. How many times does that happen? You know a hadith, you've heard it multiple times. Or there's an ayah, you've heard it multiple times. But then something happens in your life and someone reminds you of that hadith or that verse, and it's as if you've heard it the first time. So when it comes to speaking to people, I think you should speak to people, those who are older than you or those who are who wish well for you, ai counselors, therapists, doctors. You need to speak to those people who can help you. That's one aspect of it. But I would also say, keep it limited. Don't go to everyone and start talking about your grief and sadness. The Muslim, we should be vulnerable to those who we trust, but at the same time, we shouldn't completely be dependent on others. The companions were very independent people. So you should not make yourself overly vulnerable to everyone and anyone to the point where you're sharing everything. So you have to find a balance. And that balance comes with going to the right people. So you should share because they will help you and they can help you. But ultimately, your full reliance and your full complaint goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So your heart is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're looking for the solution from Allah, but you also talk to those who may be able to provide you with some advice, just to maybe hear a different opinion. So it's just finding the balance. I would say look for that balance. Don't go to everyone and anyone, because you don't want to be vulnerable to everyone and anyone, because not everyone wishes well for you and not everyone wants good for you, unfortunately. So you don't want to put yourself in a vulnerable situation to those who may go back to harm you later on. And so leave it to those who you trust, and then ultimately all your complaints go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He's the one who's in full control.
Barakallahu feek for that beautiful answer. If I may piggyback off that a little bit, I just want to add something that came to mind, which is, to your point about seeking advice, something I always, I just thought about in terms of, for myself personally, when I seek advice from my father, which is primarily whom I seek advice from in my life. And whether it's a moment of sadness or a moment of difficulty that I'm going through, sometimes the advice that he offers isn't necessarily advice, but it's just a matter of perspective and seeing it from a different light. I just thought that's something small to add there, inshallah.
Yeah, and sharing itself, it relieves the burden a little bit, You may be going through something, just sharing that story with someone, even if they don't provide like advice sometimes, just sharing it with them and having them empathize with you, make that connection with you, sometimes it helps. Your parents sometimes even might not give you a solution, but that hug from your mom or that hug from your dad, it means the world. It feels like you feel like protected. You could be like a 30-year-old or 40-year-old man, and your 67-year-old mother gives you a hug, and you feel like it solved everything. So go to those who you trust, those who mean well for you.
Inshallah. So next question we have, you mentioned to keep working in spite of grief. What if I'm fine with pushing myself to be functional, but I no longer have any goals in life? Bit of a heavier one, but
you have no goals in life. I mean, the believer always has goals in their life. The ultimate goal of the believer is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the Prophet ﷺ when the companions would come to the Prophet ﷺ and they would ask, what's the most beloved deed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You see multiple hadith regarding this, and you see a different answer. The Prophet ﷺ will answer differently for different people. Because everyone's situation is different. And so everyone's goal in life, ultimate goal, of course, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but everyone's function in life may be different. Everyone's role might be different. And your role may change from one day to another. So I don't think the believer ever loses that goal of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because at every moment, like we said, there's going to be something that you're going to be tasked with. How do you respond to this situation? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want from me at this very moment? Right? And that changes with every situation. That's why when you see those answers from the Prophet ﷺ, that someone comes and he asks the Prophet ﷺ, what's the best action in the sight of Allah? The Prophet tells him, praying on time. Praying on time is the best action. Then someone else comes and he tells him, helping the orphan. And then someone else comes, being dutiful to your parents. Everyone's situation is different. And so your situation in life is always going to change. It's not 1 year from now, you're going to be in a completely different situation from when you are here. So the believer always has goals. The ultimate goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, pleasing Allah. And it's just the avenues change. I would say to this person is that the Prophet ﷺ, he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ مَعَالِيَ الْأُمُورِ وَيَكْرَهُ سَفْسَافَهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the lofty aspirations. So a believer is never mediocre. Get that word out of your head. If you want to just be mediocre, you just want to be average, that's not the mindset of the believer. The believer always wants to be above and beyond in everything that they do. So you're a doctor, you're going to be the best doctor. You're a teacher, you're going to be the best teacher. You're someone who maybe doesn't have like a huge important job, but whatever Allah tasked you with, you're going to do that to the best of your ability. Allah loves when you have lofty aspirations. Could you have imagined the companions of the Prophet ﷺ if they thought like this? Like, we have no goals, khalas, we've all accepted Islam, we're going to go to Jannah. The Prophet ﷺ has guaranteed some of us Jannah. You know, you have the Ashar Mubashirin, you have 10 people who are guaranteed Jannah, and there's obviously more, or Kasha radiallahu anhu, other companions who are guaranteed paradise with the Prophet ﷺ. Could you imagine if they just said, khalas, there's no more goals, I've already achieved Jannah. What else do I have to do? Like, sometimes we don't think about what it means that the companions did what they did. Just imagine, like today I told you that the Eskimos of Canada are going to take over America and Mexico, and the Eskimos. You know the Eskimos? You guys know the Eskimos? If I told you today that the Eskimos are going to come down into America and just take all of America, what would you say to me? You think I'm dreaming?
Yeah,
right?
You got a few screws loose chat.
The Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ took over two of the mightiest powers of their time. No one even used to come. People used to come to the doorsteps of Arabia and just leave. They didn't want anything to do with it. It was just barren land. There's nothing there. And then out of this, you have a group of people who within just like 15 to 20 years destroy the Persians and destroy the Romans and just expand. Do you think that they had this mindset of, I don't have any goals in life? So the believer you always want to set a goal for your life. You don't have a goal, set a goal for your life. What's your calling? What's the call to action that you're going to respond to? Every single one of us has it. You just have to find it. Look at your strengths and find what is it how can I serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the best?
Can you offer any advice for dealing with sadness and anxiety specific to children? And I think maybe the questioner perhaps is, asking it from the perspective of a parent or an elderly loved one, perhaps that has a child maybe that's dealing through something like that, and they want some advice.
It's difficult.
You can pass on it.
Yeah,
Sheikh Osama often passes on
I will probably
questions.
pass on this because I don't have like older kids. I know teenagers go through. We all went through these phases of teenagers where it's a rough patch of time. Like there's a lot of emotions, hormones going on, and so it's difficult balancing those things. So every child is different. A lot of times we bunch kids into one group. Like we say that kids are all the same. When you look at developmentally, a 5-year-old is very different than a 7-year-old, and a 7-year-old is very different than a 10-year-old, and a 10-year-old is very different from a 12-year-old, and a 12-year-old is very different from a 14 and a 15-year-old. There's huge differences in the way they think, just on a developmental level, like how they perceive the world and how they understand. So, like this specific answer, I wish I could give you some guidance on it, but it might be a question for private or even Sheikh Osama maybe.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add is that, here at least Sheikh Osama always has his door open. So if there is something specific, as far as, that necessitates giving the details and the circumstances, just know that there are plenty of resources available here at ICPC.
Yeah, there's no cookie cutter answer for this, but definitely try to develop that relationship with your child where they feel like they can confide in you. If you, I think that's a very important. I think that's an advice that's across the board. That have that relationship with your child where they can confide in you, they can speak to you, and they can open up to you, and you can have those discussions openly.
I'm going to turn to the crowd for a moment to see if we perhaps inspired a few questions. Anybody have any direct questions? Okay. Back to the Slido. How to tell the difference between a test and a sign, that what you're asking for in perhaps your istikhara is not meant for you. How do you deal with the sadness?
So the question is?
The question relates to istikhara and essentially how to see if it's answered or not.
Okay, so with istikhara, it's quite simple. When you pray istikhara, you're obviously asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make things easy for you and to choose for you. So most of the time when you pray istikhara on a specific subject, you don't have to necessarily, or a specific thing. A lot of people say you have to see a dream or have someone pray istikhara for you. This is like big in Desi culture. I don't know if it's in Arab culture. Say, can you pray istikhara for this person? It's like, you pray istikhara for yourself. But istikhara, when you pray istikhara, you don't have to see a dream. It might not be like a glaring sign, but the whole idea of istikhara is that if it's good for you, it will facilitate itself. Things will fall into place. You won't even understand how things are moving and how they're falling into place the way they are. Does istikhara mean that everything will be roses and everything will be great? No, that's not what it means. But it just means that this is the best thing for you at this moment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is facilitating it for you. One thing I wanted to mention about this is that whenever things happen to you, there's a famous statement, I believe it's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, or one of the early Muslims. He says that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had laid out your life, different life options to you, like had you seen the different trajectories your life could have gone, you would have picked the one that you have currently. So the things that you're going through are the best situations that you can go through given the circumstances that you're in. So the answer I would say is just that you can never have like a hardcore answer, hard concrete answer that this is the answer. But from the effects of istikhara is that you're asking Allah to choose for you and to facilitate. And so usually those things become more easy. When you start seeing like barriers after barriers and difficulties after difficulties, you pray istikhara and it's just like all these difficulties start to come in front of you, then you kind of get a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this is probably not good for you and you should probably back up. It might not be a glaring sign, but there's always going to be something there for you to kind of make sense of it. If you don't see any sign, like it's just moving along, then just go with it. That's it. That's your sign that it's moving along.
So I have a interesting question here, which is why do some people? How can a Muslim deal with frequently experiencing death due to their career? Perhaps a doctor, or you're let's say a doctor.
How can you deal with it?
Yeah.
So I attended a end of life seminar last weekend. It was last weekend. It was in Central Jersey. It was organized by Center of Islamic Life at Rutgers University. So they spoke about this, and I was speaking to one of the speakers, and we were just reflecting over death in general. And death has become so so sterilized for us. Like for us, it's someone dies, they die in a hospital, like in a controlled environment, they die. The body's taken to the morgue, and then the body's given to the funeral service, whether it's the masjid or it's outside funeral service. A lot of the times, families don't even get involved. They just have the funeral home or the masjid do the washing. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And then the person's put on a box. They're taken to the cemetery. They bury them, and that's it. That's how our relationship with death has become. It's a very sterile. So we don't really ponder over it that much. Versus constantly being in interaction with it is a huge blessing, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, frequent or be frequent, أكثروا من ذكر هذه اللذات. Be frequent in the remembrance of death. But this is not just remembrance as in we're all going to die. No, actually reflecting over it. So if you, as a doctor or a nurse or someone who's a healthcare provider or someone who's constantly dealing with death, how do you deal with it? You constantly reflect and realize that this is the end, that we're all guaranteed, that every single one of us, this is the end. And you put your life into perspective according to that. Like when you see a lifeless body in front of you and you reflect over that, it should really put things into perspective. Like what is this craziness for money and to chase money and to make everything life about your career. You put everything into your career. You put everything into wanting to be famous or wanting to be known. Or what does all of that matter at the end of the day? This person who's in front of me, this lifeless body, they're not taking any of that. In a few days, no one's going to remember them. Maybe their kids are going to remember them. They'll pray for them. But besides that, the majority of people are not really going to be affected by your absence. So reflecting over that, taking that as a motivator, when you look at that, shouldn't make you depressed and sad. It should actually motivate you. It makes you more focused. It's not morbid. It's a huge motivator to say that, the time is short. What am I going to do during that short time? So that's one thing, is reflection. And I would say if it's causing, did they mention anything about anxiety or?
I believe they did. No.
But if it does cause you distress or anxiety, those are good emotions that you can kind of use to propel yourself towards action. That feeling of, like, this is the end, this is my end. That should be a huge motivator to push you. The early Muslims, some of them would have graves in their backyards or in their homes, and they would lay down in those graves, and then they would come out of them, and then they would brush the dirt off of their body, and they would say that this is your second chance. So those of us who interact with death regularly, every one of those deaths is a wake-up call for us, that what are we doing to change the trajectory of our lives?
Actually, one piece of advice that we've been given before here at the Friday Forum, although it's been quite some time, by Sheikh Osama, was sometimes just going to a cemetery and reflecting, and really, that kind of really helps drive home this idea and the thoughts, and helps drive that reflection.
Has anyone washed a dead person here? Has anyone washed anyone? One on the brother's side, any other sisters? Two on the sister's side. That's a very, very strong experience, and I think if you can handle it, and you should be, inshallah, it's a very strong experience. I watched someone, I think, for the first time. I watched family members, but actually like washing them and scrubbing them and doing the wudu for them. I've had family members who we just rinsed. But there was a brother who died in a nursing home, and he didn't have anyone to wash him. He didn't have any Muslim family, and his family were non-Muslim, and they said if he's going to be buried as a Muslim, we're not going to take care of it. So he actually was at Masjid. They brought him to Masjid Broadway. It was just me and another brother, and we watched him, and it was a very, very strong experience. I think if you guys if anyone who's interested, you should speak to the masjid and ask, if there's any time that anyone needs help or the washer needs help. is it okay if someone calls me or lets me know and then I can take part in that washing? I think that would be a very strong experience to kind of uh, wake up that inner, you wake up your nafs and kind of give you that shake that sometimes we need.
You mentioned to keep working in spite of grief. Actually, we didn't archive that question. How to tell the difference? Good questions here. How can a Muslim deal with frequently? I'm not doing a very good job at
No, it's
archiving
okay.
these questions. Okay. Oh no, it's because I'm in the archive itself. That's why. I should be better with technology. I'm not that old. Okay. Why do some people have bad things happen to them and others don't?
Yeah, so like we mentioned, everyone's test is different. Every single person's test is different, and no one's life is a carbon copy. So if bad things happen to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates you or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unfair towards you. You know, when all these examples that we mentioned about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and all of the prophets, if you look at their life, to say the least, they're not easy lives. You know, there's just filled with loss and sorrow and sadness, and that's why the Prophet, when the companions they asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that who are the most beloved people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet says that those who are most tested by Allah, they're the ones who are most tested, they have the most difficult lives. And the ones who are most tested are the prophets. And the Prophet says, and the ones who are most tested are the prophets. So if our ease and our difficulty in our lives meant that we were close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then billionaires like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all these guys would be the closest to Allah. And the person who comes to the masjid and prays all his prayers and he's having financial difficulty, his children are not listening to him, he's having all this hardship, he doesn't know where he's going to pay rent from. This person who's having all these difficulties, he's praying. How can we ever say that this person, this is the gauge for telling who's close and who's not? So the fact that Allah is testing you, if you are accepting those tests and you are facing those tests with rida, with contentment, and with patience, then you are on the path of the prophets. And if someone is not being tested, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best people, and it also doesn't mean that they're bad people either. You know, maybe this is a little extreme, but one of the early Muslims, she had married someone, and after a year she asked for a divorce, and he asked her why do you want a divorce? And she said that I've been married to you for 1 year and you haven't been tested. You haven't been tested. And those who are loved by Allah are tested. Obviously, we have to put this into perspective. But I'm saying what the main point here is that if you are tested and you're accepting those tests, then that's a big blessing that only raises your status. And it's not a sign of whether someone's close or far. You know, هو لا يسأل وهم يسألون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not asked on why He does things He does the way He does them. But they are asked, we are asked basically. We are asked, how do we respond? So Allah is not asked, why did Allah do this for? Why is Allah doing it that way? If you come into a classroom and the professor or the teacher, he gives you an exam, a pop quiz, he says, today's a pop quiz. So suddenly you have some people who start working on the pop quiz. They just start working. They say, "Khalas, it's a pop quiz. What am I going to do? I just have to start working." They start working. And then you have people in the back who are, "This is not fair. Why is this happening? You didn't announce whether we're going to have a pop quiz or not." They only have 60 minutes. Once that 60 minutes up, is it going to matter whether you thought about whether the test was fair or not fair? It's not going to matter. All that's going to matter is how did you do? So when it comes to Allah's decree, we can never make full sense of why things happen the way they happen, or why bad things may happen to good people. But we know that these bad things that happen to these good people is a way for them to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, in Christianity, you have something called the prosperity doctrine, which is that if good things happen to you, if you have more wealth, that means you're closer to God. We don't have that in Islam. Just because you have money doesn't mean that you're close to God. And the biggest sign of that is the Prophet ﷺ. His whole life was filled with difficulty. And he left this world, and his shield was a rahn. He had left his shield. He had a debt still. He still had debt, the Prophet ﷺ, when he passed away. So if there's anyone who had a difficult life, the Prophet ﷺ had a difficult life. And he was the most closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that any person could ever be. So this is not a gauge of why, who's close and who's not and why it happens. It's left to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah. I think something interesting to add, maybe I'm reading too deep into the question here, but from where we stand, we can't always see the trials and difficulties that others are going through. So we don't necessarily know or can say whether somebody's having an easier time than us. I guess
Yes.
a common
Yes.
American saying is grass isn't.
The grass is greener on the other side.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And then also, social media doesn't make it easier, I'm not that much on social media, but some people told me that people take pictures, like they'll have an event, they'll just take a bunch of pictures at a specific event, and then they'll post them over time. Like they'll post them 1 week and then a week later. So it makes it seem like they're always having fun and they're always having a good time. But this is deceiving. So you look at that on social media and you're thinking this person has a great life. They're out eating all the time. They're hanging out with their friends. But then you go to that person's life and they're miserable. They're using this as a way to cope. Those likes makes them feel better. They get a dopamine rush. When someone recognizes, oh, you look so nice, or that looks so fun, or they like their picture. That shows you that person is craving something, that they're missing something. So don't ever let social media, I think that's a big thing, is social media, that comparison that people have in their lives, that so-and-so, she went here and she traveled over there and he went over there and they're doing this with their life and I'm here stuck doing my 9 to 5. There's a beautiful saying, there's a beautiful quote about social media. It's like Sports Center. Only the highlights are shown. Right? So only the highlights are being shown on social media. You're not seeing everything that's actually happening in that person's life.
I was holding off on this question for a bit, but given how many upvotes it has, I think it's about time. It's a question semi-related to marriage. So the question goes, how to deal with sadness? I will say it is technically related, so we're good on that front. How to deal with sadness of not meeting your nasib, yet I feel myself longing for companionship, but remind myself what's meant for me will never miss me.
Yeah, so you have to trust that whatever is for you, like the person said, they already know the answer, that whatever is meant for them is not gonna miss them. وَمَا أَصَابَكَ لَمْ يَكُنْ لِيُخْطِئِكَ وَمَا أَخْطَأَكَ لَمْ يَكُنْ لِيُصِيبَكَ. The Prophet says that whatever has hit you is not going to miss you, and whatever has missed you was never written for you. So if something passes you by, a good proposal that you think is good for you, عَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ, that you may despise something or hate something that is good for you, and you might like something that is bad for you. So, and then what's the end of the verse? وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah knows and you don't know. So the ultimate thing to have is that trust. Because we believe in Allah and we believe He decrees. But then do we trust that whatever He decrees is best for us? That's where it comes back to. We have to have that trust. You might have wanted to marry that brother or that sister, and had you married that sister or that brother, maybe you would not have had, you might not have had a good life. You might have a difficulty. You might have a test. You might have had different tests. We never really know what's good for us. Despite all the homework that we do and everything that we see on the outer, we never really know what's good for us. So the best way to deal with that grief and that sadness is you answer the question yourself. Is to know that what's for you is going to hit you. You cannot dodge your qadr. If that is meant for you, it's going to hit you, whether you go to another country or you're here, or wherever you are. If you're destined to marry that person, you're going to marry that person. And if you're not destined to marry that person, you will never be able to marry that person. And you just have to have that full trust in Allah. Once you have that full trust that what He is planning for me is best for me, then you can let everything go on to autopilot. So, I think the person who answered this question already knows. So just give yourself comfort with that, with knowing that Allah knows and we don't know.
Do you want to continue or call it here?
So it's up to you guys. If you want to, is there any more questions or?
Yeah, we have a few more questions. Maybe take like 2 or 3 more.
We can take like 2 more.
Okay, 2 more. First, let's open up to the crowd. Any direct questions? I have a young brother right here. Tafadhal.
Yeah. You lost it, basically. Yeah.
Just to rephrase for the audience and for everybody who's online, the young brother is essentially asking about sadness and grief, but related to working hard for something. You put, as he said, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and in the end, it doesn't come into fruition.
I think that's one of the most consoling situations that you can actually have, is that when you put everything into it, it doesn't work. Because then it leaves no doubt that this wasn't meant for you. Because when you don't put everything into something, when you don't work as hard, maybe you don't study as hard for that GRE exam or the MCATs or the DAT. So what is the DAT? And you don't work as hard, and then you go to the exam and you just get like a mediocre grade, and then you apply, it doesn't work out for you, or whatever situation it may be. You do a mediocre job and it doesn't work out. You always have that thought in the back of your mind, like, what if I just gave it a little bit more? What if I tried just a little bit more? Maybe it might have worked out. But when you throw everything behind something and it doesn't work out, it's so consoling because you've done everything you could and it just didn't work out. Meaning that Allah SWT just didn't want that for you. And Allah closed that door for one reason or another. And that doesn't mean that another door that can't open. Another door will open, inshallah, or you look for that door and open that other door. But that specific door, it's not for you. Or maybe you just have to try again.
I believe we had no. Do we have any more questions in the crowd? Anybody want to ask a direct question? Okay.
We'll take one more, inshallah.
Inshallah, this will be our final question. So, I get the question goes, how to ignore other people's attitude, and I suppose this is specifically asking, about the actions of others and how it makes us feel. So how to ignore other people's attitudes that make us depressed and make us feel offended, especially if this leads to anxiety or stress in our life.
Yeah, so this would depend on who the person is, because if it's someone you can ignore, you can just ignore them. Like if it's someone who's not a family member or is not someone close, then if that person doesn't add value to your life or is making your life more stressful and difficult, then you can just not communicate with that person or not keep a relationship with that person. But if it's a family member or it's a close family member or someone that's related, then there's different levels of how you should reciprocate. Sometimes you can just keep it at a base level and just keep it cordial with that person. Or you can go above and beyond and continue doing ihsan to that person, being kind to that person. And maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would change that person's heart and make them a source of goodness and guide them towards becoming a source of goodness. One of the companions one time came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, I have family members who I am kind to and I do good to, but then they return that with hardship. They make things difficult for me and they're mean to me and they're tough with me. So it's like you're coming to a family member, you're doing all the right things and they're doing the complete opposite and they're doing adha, they're actually harming you. So the Prophet said to him, what? He said, continue doing what you're doing. Because their actions will be coal and fire for them. and your actions will be good deeds. أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. So it depends on the person who it is. If it's a person that doesn't really add value and they're not related to you, or you're not obligated to keep relations with them, then I would say just keep very basic with that person and don't interact with them as much. But if it's a family member, then they do have obligations. You fulfill those obligations and you do as much as you can. And if you want to go above and beyond and you want to get that high station, then you continue doing what you have to do and showing them ihsan and showing them good behavior and adab. And whatever they do is on them. Whatever they do is on them. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to call it there. Barakallah feek
Allah
for joining us this Friday and giving us your time. And thank you for everyone for attending. If you don't mind closing us out with a dua.
Sure. Allah yabarak feekum, everyone, for coming. And it's a Friday night, coming to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spending it here. Inshallah, everyone benefited and took something back that they can apply in their lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this blessed night to forgive us of our sins. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والحزن ونعوذ بك من العجز والكسل ونعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل ونعوذ بك من غلبة الدين وقهر الرجال. اللهم اجعل سرائرنا خيرا من علانياتنا واجعل علانياتنا صالحة. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make our exteriors better than we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make our exteriors pious and to make our interiors better than our exteriors. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts and to forgive us our sins and to accept from us our repentance. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to aid our brothers and sisters who are in Gaza. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them a swift victory and to honor them. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give our brothers and sisters in all of Palestine victory. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to aid our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, and in Sudan, and in China, and in all places around the world. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us and to accept from us and to accept our repentance and to ease our affairs. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا نكون من الخاسرين. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. آمين.